What is up, everybody? This is week 3 of the PFF NFL podcast betting show. I am Ben Linsey. With me is Judah Fortgang. Judah, how was your week? I have an inkling it was pretty good based on some of the SGPs we ended on with New Orleans and Las Vegas. Big upsets, big offensive production. How was your week 2?
Yeah, not bad. The beauty of kind of betting on these tail spots is like, even if you're wrong on more than half the games, or even like 75%, if you kind of get a couple of these right and really nail the script, then it can still be very profitable. And thankfully that was the case with New Orleans. And we talked a lot about that last week and saying, you know, if Kubiak can kind of find some way to mitigate pressure, I think this is a sneaky spot. Thankfully he was able to capitalize on that. Would have been really special if Carr kind of reached some more of those milestone yards, but I'm not going to complain with that. And then obviously the Raiders helped me out there with a little bit of passing towards the end of the game and a nice comeback. All in all, though, solid betting week. Hopefully can kind of channel that to an even better week 3.
Yeah, I was kind of hesitant on the Saints. I was like, it's week 1. They played the Panthers. Kubiak was doing some good stuff. Dallas is a whole different beast, and I'm sold. I'm sold now. You saw Micah Parsons after the game talking about all the creative ways they were chipping him and kind of mitigating his pass rush, and Kubiak seems legit. So that NFC South could be sneakily better than everyone thought, with the Saints, the Bucks, the Falcons coming from behind. They didn't look completely inept on offense again against the Eagles. So fun division outside of Carolina.
And maybe the red rifle is all that's needed to turn Carolina around. He
kind of balled out in that game he played in last year.
That's right. That's right. I think we'll really see the difference between the situation by looking at the production difference between Dalton and Young. That's at least an intriguing storyline, if nothing else, to follow the Panthers.
For sure. Let's go forward to week 3, though, and we're starting out with a game for the sickos. Right? It's Steelers against Chargers. The Steelers are 1.5 point favorites, 35.5 point total. Do you think both teams kind of in this matchup want to control the game on the ground and play complementary football with their defense? Right? That's been the case with the Steelers for a few years. That's the case with the Chargers now, with Jim Harbaugh coming in as head coach. And they've had success through the first couple weeks, albeit against some less than stellar opponents, I'll say. But both teams are 2-0. Big game for both of them here. How do you see it playing out?
Yeah, I think the main thing here is the rushing on both sides of the ball. Right. These are both teams. I mean, I'm going to throw out the Packers as like right now they have the highest run rate over expected. Right. We talked about this last week. Expectation, meaning relative to game situation. Obviously, if you're up by 21, you're going to have a very different run rate than when you're down 21. So adjusting for those situational factors, Green Bay's number 1. But I think that's like a 1-week anomaly where like clearly the game plan was we are not letting Malik Willis drop back. And then if you look at number 2 and 3, it is the Chargers and the Steelers. And then you kind of look on the flip side, on the defensive side of the ball. If you look at most efficiency metrics, these are the top teams stopping the run. According to part of that has to do with the opponents they faced. Right, Denver does not have a particularly great running game. It appears. The Panthers are obviously not exactly the most dominant of matchups for the Chargers, nor the Raiders' rushing offense look any good. But like there is some, work to be done, kind of piecing out the signal from the noise, so to speak, from here. And I think that's kind of where this main angle of the game goes. Because to your point, like both teams don't want to run. And I'm not sure if the Chargers, interestingly enough, schematically seem like they're not actually stopping the run at all. And it's a question of like, okay, were their opponents just bad? And that's why like a reason for their success? Or are they just going to be able to kind of win up front? In which case, like they'll actually be able to hide kind of some of the personnel issues they have on the defense because they're dropping 8 in coverage and still having success running the ball. I think that's a particularly intriguing angle and one I'm going to be looking forward to. But I think the name of the game here is like who runs the ball better, who stops the run better. Not the sexiest of matchups, but I think that's really kind of determinative of how this game's going to be played.
Yeah, I'm with you. You kind of mentioned the situation adjusted run rates, just looking at the overall run rates, both teams in the top 5, both teams in the top 3 in EPA per play, stopping the run. And so it really comes down to which of these defenses can get the opposing offense out of what they want to do and get them into those passing situations, because both teams do have edge rushers specifically who can wreck the game. Right. When you get into those obvious passing situations, the Steelers with TJ Watt, that's actually a matchup that's really interesting, is Watt lining up over that right tackle side almost exclusively, going up against Joe Alt, who has had a lot of success, especially in pass protection early in his career. He looks as advertised, did a good job against Max Crosby in week 1, not an easy matchup at all. But Watt is capable of, obviously he's capable of winning that matchup still, right? It'll be a tough test if you can get the Chargers into those second and longs, third and longs. And when I look at the Los Angeles rushing offense, I think it's they've been living on these explosives early in the season, these big J.K. Dobbins runs. And you can kind of see that in the split just from efficiency versus success rate. So they're 11th in EPA per run. They're 28th, I believe, in success rate. So they've been living on these 40, 50-yard runs from Dobbins. I don't really know how sustainable that is against the Steelers front that is really talented. It's a better front than even the Raiders, or you've got the stars in Wilkins and Crosby, but the Steelers have a better overall front than Las Vegas does, and certainly better than Carolina. Cam Hayward coming back in the middle of that defensive line has been massive for them. He got hurt early last year, came kind of rushed back midseason and wasn't the same guy to end the year, but he looks fully healthy, and he's our number 1 graded interior defensive lineman against the run through 2 weeks. He's got that old man strength in the middle of that D line to go along with TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith and Keanu Benton, who's coming on. So I think that the Steelers might be able to limit what Los Angeles wants to do in the run game and then turn their pass rushers loose, which Slater and Alt on paper, great tackle combination there. But I think they might be able to get after Herbert, who did roll his ankle last week. It seems like he's going to be fine. He's going to play, but maybe a little bit less mobility in this matchup. And if the Steelers can do that, it's going to be an uphill battle for Los Angeles with the receiving talent they have at wide receiver and tight end.
Yeah, I think that's also right to highlight in specific why the pass rush matchup matters, I think, a little bit more, which is like Justin Herbert's mobility is definitely affected, right? He has an ankle injury, and I think that those are the plays on the margins, especially in a game where the point spread is 1.5 points here, that can really kind of shift the tide. But I want to also focus on something you said about the run game. And one of the intriguing elements from the Chargers rush offense, which is like, obviously they were a disaster last season. But they brought in Greg Roman, and PFF charts what we call perfectly blocked runs, which are plays in which no offensive lineman makes a mistake, i.e. they do their job and the offense be successful. And if you break up the splits from rushes that are perfectly blocked versus not perfectly blocked, it is a massive gap. It's the equivalent of having the best offense in football versus the worst offense in football. And LA's rate this season has jumped from 43% last year to 68% this year. Now, 68% is probably very high, but this is a similar number to what we've seen Greg Roman offenses do. Granted, a lot of that has to do with Lamar Jackson as quarterback, but there is some reason there to believe that the explosiveness of the Chargers rushing offense is just a function of like when you have a lot of these perfectly blocked opportunities, you're going to break big runs. And I think there's some reason to believe that is semi-sustainable, maybe not at the rate that the Chargers have had, but directionally that is something that can be somewhat sticky. But I do think, kind of to your point, like this game is almost a matter of like who can force the other out of what they wanted to do. And we have no real sample, especially given the turnover, right? The Steelers have a new offensive coordinator, a new quarterback. The Chargers themselves have a new offensive coordinator that we don't really know these teams outside of the game script that they've played in 2 games. And there are a lot of diverging paths for how I see this one playing out as a result.
The angle I'm kind of interested in on the Pittsburgh offense is George Pickens looks like he's kind of made a jump. All right, he's a legit number one receiver, and just the raw receiving totals might not tell that story. I think he's around 120 receiving yards, doesn't have a touchdown through 2 weeks. But a lot of his big plays have gotten called back by penalties. So if you look at just most receiving yards in the NFL, including plays called back by penalties, 1 is Nico Collins, 2 is George Pickens. He had a dime from Justin Fields last week against Sertan that got called back for a holding penalty. He also drew a 40-yard pass interference penalty in that game that doesn't go into the receiving stats. So if that's something where, say the Chargers run defense is real, they're stopping the Steelers on the ground, which the Steelers they're gonna stick to the run no matter what. That's their philosophy. They have Arthur Smith. They're going to run the ball. But I think there's opportunities for Pickens to win downfield on some of these play action plays, a ton of play action from Pittsburgh. They've been moving the pocket with Justin Fields, kind of boot him, look for Pickens downfield. And he's up there near the top of the league in terms of just ball winning ability, even if a guy is kind of right in his hip pocket.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually probably I'll take us in a slightly different path, but I think the kind of ripping off the main thesis there, I think my favorite kind of SGP angle from this game is the Chargers playing out from a lead and Fields. Right now, the market is pricing in Fields as this extremely low volume quarterback that doesn't really have a path towards a lot of yards. But I think you're right to highlight that he's throwing the ball deep a lot, and the results actually are kind of fluky there. He's had a lot of yards called back by virtue of penalties. Defense pass interference is a penalty, but that kind as well. And I think if you look at a game script in which the Chargers are playing from ahead, I think it's more likely that we see Fields, at least relative to his props, kind of go out for a huge day. And I think it's he's throwing a lot of these. I mean, he must have thrown 4 or 5 of these kind of one-on-one balls. A couple of them just hit off Van Jefferson's hands, right? You mentioned a few of the Pickens ones. And I think that's a very viable path where the Steelers are a little bit more pass-heavy by virtue of trailing. The market's kind of regressing to game scripts in which the Steelers have played from ahead. And I think you can kind of parlay that angle nicely. And not that much needs to go right for Justin Fields to throw for 225 yards, 250 yards, and you're going to get a very, very steep price on that alt. And I think it only happens in a game script in which the Chargers are playing from ahead. And we kind of mentioned all of the reasons why that could be.
Yeah. The nice thing there, too, is where the ball is going. It's going to Pickens. Their number 2 receiver, Van Jefferson, probably Pat Freiermuth, if you want to throw him in there. Whereas on the LA side, it's a little bit murkier, right? Quentin Johnston got the 2 touchdowns last week, but hard to tell on a week-to-week basis who's going to get the looks there. So just to recap, I kind of do like Pittsburgh in this one, -1.5. I think they're going to be able to slow down the Chargers' rushing offense, and I think they're going to be able to get some pressure on Justin Fields by getting him into those passing situations. Kind of goes against the Pickens angle, because if they're playing from ahead, you're probably going to see a heavy dose of Najee Harris and Jalen Warren and even Cordarrelle Patterson. Shout out to him coming back with Arthur Smith to Pittsburgh. But I like the Steelers in a close one. Right? The Steelers are never a team that's going to win by margin. It seems like they're always in these games that come down to 1-score games in the fourth quarter. But at the 1.5 total, I think they're the better team, and I think they get a win here.
Yeah, not a side play for me here, but I am going to be playing that alt in a game script in which the Chargers are leading. I think Fields is live to go well over his passing prop.
We move on to another game with 2-0 teams, with the Houston Texans and the Minnesota Vikings. Houston's favored by 2.5. Total is 45.5 when we're recording on a Wednesday afternoon here. And the Houston offense, kind of a shaky day against Chicago. All right, Chicago has a pretty good defense that was able to make Stroud uncomfortable a little bit and force him outside the pocket, and he made a lot of great plays outside the pocket. That's an area of his game that he's definitely improved. That was kind of the big question coming out of Ohio State, is his creation ability. And you saw the flashes in that game against Georgia, and you saw the flashes as the season progressed his rookie year. He looks fully comfortable, right, when he's creating outside the pocket now. But you don't want him having to do it as much as he did in that Chicago game. Minnesota on the other side, Sam Darnold he's winning downfield, man. He looks decent. Whether that's a function of the Kevin O'Connell offense, but they've been down some of their top targets. TJ Hawkinson hasn't played yet this year. Justin Jefferson left that game last week. Jordan Addison was out. Some question marks about those receiver status coming into this game, but how do you think this one kind of goes from a game script perspective?
It's Josh Naylor season, I think. The new Minnesota wide receiver too. Yeah, I think the central question here is like, how good is this Minnesota defense? And like, it's one thing to kind of beat the Giants down. It's another thing to like slow down San Francisco as well. And like we mentioned a lot about Brian Flores as this great coordinator. I think Jonathan Greenard is one of the more underrated edge players in the NFL. He was great with Houston last season. Has been putting up terrific numbers early this season. It's a different ballgame, though, going up against Houston to do it again, especially considering CJ Stroud has been terrific against the blitz. Minnesota obviously loves the blitz a lot. They were, I believe, first in the NFL last season. They're third this year, blitzing close to 50% of their snaps. CJ Stroud had 9 yards per attempt last year against the blitz. Early signs from this year suggest similar stats. And it's, I think, a real question of like, can Minnesota slow them down? Is Houston going to run the ball a whole bunch against Minnesota? It's kind of a little bit of a toss-up of like how they're going to do their run pass rates, I think. And I'm also a little bit concerned about Houston's lack of explosive plays. Granted, like some of that could be the Chicago defense is good, but if you're really going to be elite, you expect that consistent production kind of week after week, and that hasn't happened. I mean, Tank Dell had a couple of big drops that would make this story look a little different, but I think the signs are starting to crack a little bit on Houston. And CJ Stroud, he's making a lot of plays out of structure, but he's also taking a lot of sacks. And there are a lot of these 3 and outs so far for Houston that I'm not sure they've kind of made that leap from the offense they were last year, which is very explosive and at times can put up these huge stats, to a real consistent team that's going to score week in and week out. And when you look at that against a potentially frisky Minnesota defense, I think there are a lot of questions here. And it's a very complicated game to break down.
Yeah, it seems like the strategy on defense for Minnesota is they're going to give up yards. I bet Brock Purdy's over last week. He went for over 300 yards. They're going to let teams move down the field, but you force a few of those high leverage mistakes and get your offense an extra possession, and it works out right in your favor. As far as the run pass splits for Houston, I do think this is a game they might try to lean into the run more, similar to week 1, what we saw against the Colts. Joe Mixon seems like he's going to be okay. Right? He kind of rolled up his ankle on that hip drop tackle in the Chicago game, but he returned to the game. And Houston is one of the biggest outside zone teams in the NFL. 64% outside zone rate through week 2. It's not a huge sample, but second highest in the NFL. And the Vikings have kind of struggled defending those wide zone runs. You look back to 2023, they were in the bottom half of the league. They're 31st in EPA allowed per play this season through 2 weeks. Again, small sample. It's only 19 runs, but still noteworthy, especially just because when you look at how their front is set up. Their edge rushers, Van Ginkel, Grenard, useful players, good pass rushers, versatile players. I don't think they're great edge setters in the run game and kind of capping that outside wall on the outside zone runs. And then the interior has guys who can get kind of pushed back. Right? So Houston, you saw how many hits Stroud took in that Chicago game. Talked about the sacks. He's top 10 in knockdown rate through 2 weeks. I think this is just a situation where they're going to be like, okay, they're 11th in pass rate over expected through 2 weeks. Maybe get back to kind of moving the ball through the run game a little bit more against a defense that might be susceptible to giving up those yards in chunks. Mixon has actually looked good and healthy and explosive through the first couple of weeks. Maybe that changes a little bit if his ankle's gimpy, but I think this is a spot where they can have some success on the ground.
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of the spot to look at. And it's for me, the reason I'm not kind of all over this game betting it is like, I don't want to coach my bets and try and say like, this is what I think they will. I have no clue. And it's like, I think it's right to kind of point out the path dependencies here. And why maybe it's a spot to bet live of just kind of seeing the angles and seeing, are they running a bunch of outside zone? Are they going to have success? And that probably elevates the floor of this offense. And then you can start to layer in a lot of these play action passes that they like to do, a lot of these kind of rollouts. And that's where Strad's had a lot of success. But when I just think about like, how am I going to bet this game? It's a lot more questions. And we talk about this all the time, but I think it is worth reiterating. The benefit we have as bettors is getting to choose when we bet. Books have to put out lines for every game. And I think you almost want to have a threshold. It doesn't make for like, the sexiest content everyone wants to play. But I think in making smart bets, it's important to actually make sure you have some sort of angle or edge, at least as you perceive it, in order to actually place the bet. And that's the biggest advantage we as bettors have.
Real quick before we move to the Minnesota offense side, the target distribution in Houston, at least in terms of production, last year it seemed pretty even, right? Nico was getting the ball, Tank was getting the ball, Dalton Schultz was getting the ball, Noah Brown was getting the ball. This year it's been heavy Nico, and he's been awesome. But do you see that changing kind of as the season progresses? Is it just noise in a 2-game sample that Tank Dell has 4 catches for 37 yards through 2 weeks, and Diggs is kind of had a quiet start to the season as well?
Yeah, I don't think it's noise. I think like, and that says more about Nico Collins than it does anyone else, which is that like, I think Nico Collins is for real and is like a top receiver in this league. I mean, his ability after the catch is like, he doesn't do it in the same way as Deebo Samuel, but he's one of the most effective after the catch players in the NFL. Tank Dell's production, I think, looks very different. He's dropped 2 deep balls. I think one was pretty obvious. I mean, they had that rollout play, and CJ Stroud found him right over the middle of the field and just dropped it. I think that looks very different, the stat lines, of course. And Diggs is not being used in the same way he has in the past. He's a shallow A-dot guy right now. I think that he would need a lot of receptions in order to kind of have a big yardage day, just by virtue of the role that he occupies. That can, of course, change via injury, but I think it's here to stay. Of like, Collins is the guy who's going to be the most consistent and have the most diverse route tree. Dell is going to be the one who's going to take the top off and win on these deep passes. And they're using Diggs in kind of these short yardage situations and a lot in the red zone. Throwing Dalton Schultz there too. He's a pretty solid tight end, and I think that it's here to stay. I think that's just kind of how they're utilizing guys, at least until someone goes down.
Yeah, Nico is a really fun player, man. There's not that many receivers. You talked about the after the catch ability, who are also these big, physical, legit X receivers. Like it's kind of in the AJ Brown mold of guys who pick up yards after the catch through their physicality and their size and their speed, rather than kind of the shiftiness we usually see.
Yeah, he doesn't strike you as the type. That's what I think is particular. Like, it doesn't pass the eye test. But I digress.
What are we thinking about Sam Darnold and this Minnesota Vikings offense? Is this a legit like playoff contending offense once they get some of their pieces back and get healthy? Is Darnold, has he turned a page, right? Is he on the Geno Smith career arc here in Minnesota?
Here's the thing. Like, we had a bunch of quarterbacks last season for the Vikings, like, have relative success, right? Like, Nick Mullins was putting up numbers last season. Josh Dobbs was like winning them some games. I think that says more about Kevin O'Connell and the scheme that they have. But dare I say it, I think Houston's going to be the toughest defense that they've faced so far. I think San Francisco is pretty overrated on the defensive side of the ball. And I think that we're going to see some really drastic splits with Minnesota, depending on how often they're able to kind of stay in structure and stay within the scheme. And like, Sam Darnold has some seriously drastic splits over the years of pressure versus not. And I think it's going to be pretty matchup dependent. I don't think like we learned anything new about Darnold. He's fine producing kind of within structure. He has been that way, frankly, for most of his career. He was just like in Adam Gase offenses, and then like had a tiny bit of success actually in Carolina towards the ends of that season. So I don't think we learned anything new. I think that like Kevin O'Connell's got a great scheme, and that means that the matchups that they have are going to become more relevant, because when you have Patrick Mahomes out there, the matchups he's going to create for himself such that the matchups matter a little bit less. He also has probably a great scheme, and that doesn't hurt. But I think when you kind of look at the way I like to think about this is, let's say your like base rate is like 70% of scheme plays, and scheme plays are going to have a much higher base rate of success. If you kind of move that on the fringe from like 60 in really hard matchups to 80 in really easy matchups, I think that's where a lot of the kind of like game to game stuff matters. And in spots where you have 60% success, the 40% is so bad that it's going to outweigh the 60, and Minnesota can underperform. Whereas in spots where you're playing the Giants and you're basically staying within structure the entirety of the time, you're going to see these big numbers. So I think it's really going to come down to like the matchups and like, do they have a schematic advantage? And then how many plays are they going to have within that schematic advantage? And I think Houston's a little bit closer to, I made up numbers here with 70, but let's stick with those fake numbers, a little bit closer to like the 65 or 60% of plays that will be within scheme, just by virtue of like what they've done defensively. And I think there's a lot of talk about CJ Stroud, but they've been really good by basically every efficiency metric. And I think that kind of continues. And I see the Vikings maybe have a little bit more trouble. And that will, I think, kind of shift the conversation a bit to like, oh, is Sam Darnold back or not?
Yeah, a couple of the questions that I have in mind on this side of the ball is, one of the biggest strengths on the Houston defense is they have two legit dudes at defensive end in Will Anderson and Danielle Hunter. But it's a strength on strength matchup. Christian Darrisaw, Brian O'Neill, very good on the Minnesota Vikings offensive line. That's a unit that has gotten better significantly over the last couple of years. That used to be a real strength, especially on the interior, but that's a group that has continued to improve. So can they limit that pressure because of the clean pressure splits you talked about with Darnold? And then can Darnold hit a few of those shots downfield? Because that's something that he's looked very willing to do through the first few weeks of the season. He has 5 completions, 20-plus yards downfield. That's tied for second most in the league, 210 passing yards. Obviously, a 97-yard pass to Justin Jefferson is going to help those numbers. But he's looked comfortable, even beyond the Jefferson throw, which was great. When Jefferson was out and they had no Jordan Addison, so Jalen Naylor is your guy, and hitting him on that seam ball in the fourth quarter, right, that back shoulder, it's a great throw. And Darnold's looked confident. And I think that's, speaking about the Vikings quarterback last year, that's something you saw from Nick Mullins. Right? They're going to pull the trigger downfield. Nick Mullins, the offense was basically Justin Jefferson's down there somewhere, right? And I'm going to launch it 30 yards downfield. It led to a lot of interceptions and bad decisions, but led to some big plays too, man. And I think you've got a better version of that with Sam Darnold. You saw the Colts hit Houston twice on deep posts to Alec Pierce. Chicago wasn't able to get anything going downfield against them. And I'm not sure whether that's a function of Houston, whether that's a function of the Chicago offense. Not sure what to make of that, honestly. But I think Minnesota is one of these teams, assuming Jefferson comes back, which it looks like he will. He was at practice today with the quad contusion. Jordan Addison has a chance to come back from his injury. It seems less likely than Jefferson when we're talking here on Wednesday. But if you can hit a few of those big plays, I think that's really what has to happen for Minnesota, because the Houston defense is talented, right? And they're probably not going to be able to march the ball down the field. So you need to rely on those explosives.
Yeah. No, I think that's honestly, as you said, a great SJP angle of like, right, if Minnesota is going to win, it's almost definitely by virtue of like an explosive passing attack, which you're going to get some inverse correlation betting on like a Minnesota 5.5 and a Sam Darnold over passing yards. And then, Jefferson's props are going to be obviously very high. They're aware that Justin Jefferson is good at football, but like someone like a Josh Naylor add on there as an intriguing tails angle, I think. You're absolutely right. That I think that's almost the only way, at least offensively, for them to kind of win.
Yeah, and just to close out that point, Houston is a big cover 4 or quarters team. So you have those 4 deep zone defenders, which in theory is kind of limiting shot plays. But if you go back to the start of last year, 2023, third most 20+ yard receptions allowed. So they have been a team that has given up some explosives, and personnel is different. You got Kamari Lassiter in there. You've got some changes on that defense, but I think that's how Minnesota is going to have to win, and honestly, not something that I hate looking at as far as a bet in this game.
I like it.
All right, let's move on. This one is not. So the first two games we hit, both 2-0 teams. This one is not. The Lions dropped a game last week to Tampa Bay, but Lions Cardinals should be a fun one. 51.5 point total, projected to be really high scoring. The Lions are 3-point favorites, and the Cardinals, man, Kyler, what a game from him last week. Making plays outside of structure, making plays in structure, hitting guys on corner routes with underneath and coverage over the top. He was pretty much perfect. And it's fun when you've got a player as talented as Kyler playing like that, kind of like we saw that first half of the 22 season when he was in the MVP conversation. And they've got weapons. Right? Marvin Harrison, the speed concerns quickly went away in that first quarter. Trey McBride, one of the best tight ends in the league. James Conner, just a really good, consistent rusher. They do some fun things in the run game. This can be a really fun and efficient offense, I think, throughout this year. It really comes down to, can their defense give them enough? And they did against the Rams, but that was because the Rams were without half of their starting lineup on offense, in my opinion. And I think it might be a different story here against Detroit.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right kind of long-term frame for the Cardinals. And I would just add to that, I mean, I was definitely high on them coming into the season. That the only sample we had of Kyler Murray was with really Cliff Kingsbury, and then coming off the ACL injury, he was kind of like thrown into a lost season and eased back into action of that's Drew Petzing. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I think that's something along those lines. But
I think you're right. I think you're right.
By Petzing, it's a tough one. But people can't pronounce my last name for some reason. Fortgang, it's a compound word. Fort and gang. We always get the Fortang. Yeah. Don't understand why. But either way, I think that if you look at, we're talking about structure versus not, Kyler Murray has been insanely good in structure. And I think his reputation is he's this great scrambler. And he does have an element to that game. And he scrambled at the 7th highest rate so far. But he's been pretty good there. What's really kind of elevated him in both this year and the 2022 season that you mentioned, 2021, I don't remember, whatever year that was that he was in the MVP discussion. I was just going through it in my head. I think it's 2021, but either way, he's really shined actually in structure. That's the spot where he's at his best. And I'm willing to believe that that's sustainable. And to your point, it's really a question on the defensive side of the ball, which leaves us in a very interesting spot. If we want to take a look at the markets right now, Arizona is a 3-point underdog at home. And obviously, if we're just looking at how these two teams, the Cardinals and Lions, have played so far this season, the line would not be 3, right? It would be Arizona would be maybe a pick 'em at worst. But I think there is some kind of relevance to what the Lions have done in the past. And this is a very similar cast of characters. What's particularly interesting to me is that the run game has been fine. The run game is averaging a much higher EPA per rush. Their perfectly blocked rate is 2% higher than it was last year. By all accounts, the run game's fine. What's been weird is that the plays for Jared Goff, the area of the game, this in structure, when he's not disrupted being plays with either perfect coverage or pressure, which throws a quarterback off of his reads or progression. He's 26th in EPA per play so far in that category, where he's been top 3 each of the last 2 years. Now, it's very likely that that's just a weird fluky 2-game sample and this sort of thing happens. Or I don't know if you're seeing any of this on the film, but it's a push and pull league. Are there elements of the Lions scheme which defensive coordinators are catching up to a bit? It's possible. I don't know. But I think this is a spot where if they're not able to take advantage of Arizona, because it really is a question of what's Arizona going to give them? What's the Arizona defense going to give Arizona? I should clarify. And like, this is almost the same test for the Lions of like, if they can't do this against Arizona, are they gonna be able to do it at all? And I'm not willing to jump ship yet because we have a decent sample of the Lions as this good team. But I think it's an important frame to keep in mind of like, this team's going to run the ball fine. And that might be enough also, just like in this matchup of like the Cardinals have teams are running against them at the third highest rate relative to expectation. They can't stop the run. It's been this way for a couple of years. The Lions are going to have success. Maybe they just pound it down their throats. And that's kind of the path towards success. But if they're kind of getting into this passing game and they're struggling against Arizona, I have some concerns here. I'm curious your take on the Lions' issues the past couple of weeks and kind of how you see the main angles of this game.
Yeah, I think when I'm looking, I'll start with the Arizona defense. I think from a talent perspective, they're clearly lacking on the defensive side, but I think they're doing some good things schematically. And I know when Gannon signed there as the head coach, he kind of got clowned, but I think they are doing some interesting things schematically that kind of match up with things that Jared Goff has struggled with. And going back to the end of Goff's tenure with the Rams and really kind of the decline with Fangio specifically and how teams started defending him, it was the 5 and 6 man fronts. That was one part of it. But it's also, if you're going to be this under center play action quarterback, it's changing the picture post snap where you're going to execute the play fake. You turn around, there's a different look than what you saw pre-snap. And that's something that Arizona does. They will get linebackers up at the line of scrimmage. They will drop guys. They will bring guys on the blitz. They've been a pretty big blitz team this year. And they'll also rotate their safeties a good amount. And I think that's something that has given Goff trouble. It's something that Arizona might be able to force a few of those bad decisions, throwing over the middle of the field into windows where guys are that he's not expecting. So kind of similar to what we talked about with the Minnesota Vikings offense. The Cardinals defense is going to need to rely on those turnovers because, like you said, I think Detroit's going to be able to control the ball in the run game and move the ball down the field. But if Arizona can get some of those splash plays, that might be enough with what they have on offense. And Detroit, the other issue they've had, it's not like they haven't been able to move the ball at all. Like they have 11 red zone trips, 11 red zone drives. That's tied most in the NFL with Philadelphia. They've been bad in the red zone. They have not been able to finish drives. 27% red zone touchdown rate, 3 for 11. That's 4th lowest in the NFL. So it's not as if the sky is falling for Detroit. It's just not quite as good as what we've seen the last couple of years with that Ben Johnson, Jared Goff marriage.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And almost the right frame of mind to have. And I think the markets almost have that right. But there are definitely a lot of these paths of like how this game can kind of go off script. And we haven't really talked about this side of the ball, but I think the Arizona, we talked about the Arizona offense being for real, but this is a Lions pass defense that I think many of us kind of expected to take that next step of like Aiden Hutchinson taking this year 2 leap, and he's been great. But the secondary is still kind of weak, and they're still allowing a lot of these explosive plays. They're not generating a pass rush at the rate that we anticipated, and I think a lot of their numbers are inflated, frankly, against a Rams offensive line, which is maybe only behind the Patriots. They're starting like third stringers all over the place here. But I think there's a script in which the Lions run the ball effectively and like press them, but like they can't convert in the red zone or just like they move the ball a bunch. But when you're not relying on explosive plays and you're marching up and down the field, we actually wrote about this at PFF a couple of years ago. It's a problem in conditional probability of like, even if you're the best offense in the league and you go 10 yards at a time and your series conversion rate is 70%, right? If you are doing that to the 6th power, it's still a low chance of success because you are like series after series, you're allowing a 30% chance of you not converting, as opposed to an explosive offense where you're getting 30 of those yards off the bat. You don't need that much more to go right. You're already kind of in scoring position. So I think there's an interesting game script here where it's like the Lions run the ball well. they're going to do that. I think there's like no reason to think that they wouldn't. But Arizona's explosive passing attack is really what's driving this game, and they're the ones putting up the points. And you can kind of get this nice inverse correlation. This is an SGP I'll be on of like Jahmyr Gibbs and or David Montgomery rushing overs, and also telling the story of Arizona winning and doing so via the explosive pass plays. These also work very well together because that means if Arizona is scoring with few plays, that means there are plenty of plays to go around on the Detroit side for runs. That's generally a problem of like, if you're running the ball a lot, you're also taking up more clock, but you can still kind of get enough of that play volume if Arizona is successful via the explosive passing attack. I'm wondering what you're thinking about that angle in general, and in particular, like what's going on with the Lions defense.
Yeah, I think if Arizona is going to win this game, which I think they have a good chance to, it's going to be with the passing game. We talked a little bit early in the season about the Lions' run defense being the stronger unit, and you want to pass the ball against them. And to your point, Aiden Hutchinson, he had 4.5 sacks against the Buccaneers. They still lost the game, but he's been dominant so far, and that is an area of concern because Jonah Williams was supposed to be the starting right tackle coming into the year for Arizona. He gets hurt, so you have Kelvin Beachum back. A guy who's experienced, not a complete liability out there, but it is not your starting right tackle going into the year. The thing that's interested me with Arizona so far this year is you think of them back with Kingsbury, specifically at the start of Kingsbury's tenure. It was spread. It was 10 personnel. And now you're in this situation where they have more plays with multiple tight ends on the field than any other team in the NFL through the first 2 weeks of the season. And that does a couple of things. It really benefits the passing attack because you're getting base looks. So they 26 pass plays with multiple tight ends on the field this season. They're averaging 10.3 yards per play on those. And the Lions are one of these defenses that when they see multiple tight ends on the field, they're going to match with base defense. 70% last year, second highest in the league. 100% through the first 2 weeks this year. It's only 9 plays, but 100%. Both of Marvin Harrison Jr.'s touchdowns came out of those looks last week. McBride eats in those situations. And this is a spot that I really like McBride. He's had a really nice kind of target volume and role in this offense through the first couple of weeks. Hasn't had a dominant game. I think this is a spot where you could see that kind of breakthrough performance for him. And that's how Arizona is going to win. Like I like their running game. I think James Conner, I mentioned, is a really solid runner, a tough, hard to bring down on first contact. But if Arizona is going to win this game, it's going to have to be on the back of Kyler Murray, and specifically, I think, getting into those heavy looks and attacking the Lions-based defense out of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I would just, for those unfamiliar with base, can you clarify what is base and why does that put Arizona in such an advantageous matchup?
Yeah, base is essentially you have 4 defensive backs on the field. So it's called base because that is, in theory, that is the normal alignment. So if you're in a 4-3, you have 4 defensive linemen, 3 linebackers, 4 defensive backs. If you're in a 3-4, just the inverse. Now, the modern NFL nickel is the predominant alignment, which is 5 defensive backs on the field. So when you get those plays with 4 defensive backs on the field, and this is something that the Lions on the other side of the ball have taken advantage of in prior years, a little bit less so this year. But when you get that an extra linebacker on the field or an extra bigger body on the field instead of a defensive back, it just creates better situations, particularly over the middle of the field for your tight ends, for your slot receivers, because they're going against guys who are not as good coverage defenders as a defensive back.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think also points to how you can kind of use personnel, diverse like packages and different ways for offensive coordinators to kind of put their players in positions to succeed. And I think this is kind of a great example of that, right? There's a lot of discussion at a high level of like this. I mean, maybe I'm the only one who's talking about this. What do I know? Of like this cat and mouse game of like, oh, passing's down. Like defensive coordinators are playing a lot of these too high, but it's like it lives in things like what you just described of how the Cardinals are utilizing and effectively via their personnel forcing defenses to play base and kind of using that to their advantage of understanding like how certain coordinators operate that can lead to some particularly compelling betting angles, both from a team perspective and, as you said, like looking at Trey McBride. I think that's a great shot.
And it works because the Cardinals have tight ends who can block, and they have a good running game. Like there's teams who go at, like when the Bengals go into 12 personnel with Mike Gesicki, it's like, okay, we're not going to play base. All right. We talked about it a little bit with the Bills when they've got Kincaid and Knox on the field. It's like, we're not probably going to play base against that. But with Arizona, with McBride and Elijah Higgins and Tip Ryman, who they drafted as a blocking kind of inline tight end, it works because you have to respect that. And we saw games like last week against the Rams where if you don't, they can run it down your throat too.
Yeah, no, and this is like where certain elements of like the data doesn't necessarily show up of like this stuff does matter. And they play off each other, and none of this is happening in isolation, that all of this stuff matters. And Arizona's a good offense, man. And I think they've got the pieces to really be one of the best ones in the NFL.
To recap, this is a game that I'm going to be on a side. I'm probably going to be on Arizona. I think 3 is too much, to your point about kind of what's played out so far this season versus our priors of these teams. And then I'm going to be on McBride. Right? The lines haven't come out yet, but I'm imagining it's not going to be to the point where I'm not going to want to take it. Probably nothing on the Detroit side for me.
Yeah, I did like the under. It's been bet down a little bit already to this point, but I think kind of the main SGP angle here is betting on the Detroit rushing game and Arizona to win via explosive plays and the pass game.
All right, let's round out kind of our single game deep dives with one of the Monday Night Football games. We've got a doubleheader this week. How do you feel about the 7:30, 8:15 doubleheader on Monday night? I
just think of like the back in the day, like a 7:15 Monday Night Football game, and then a game in the A's stadium for the Raiders at 10:15. That's the stuff I like. Stagger the games, allow me to watch both. I don't like this like 7:30, 8:15 thing at all. I want to be watching all the football I can with as much attention as I have. I don't know if I feel the same way.
It might be a boomer take from me, but I can't. 10-15 football games, I cannot get behind that. I'm not gonna stay up until 1:30 in the morning to watch a football game. At least that I don't want to. I will, but I don't want to. But Jags Bills. Let's get to it. Buffalo is 4.5 point favorites, 45.5 point total. And Jacksonville, I don't know what to make of this team. I honestly don't really know what to make of either of these teams. So it's kind of a chaotic matchup. There's some definite schematic angles to attack here, but what are your initial thoughts parsing through this matchup?
Yeah, I think this is a real strength on strength matchup. And what I mean by that is Jacksonville has been terrible in defending against quick pressure. They're allowing quick pressure at the third highest rate. And Miami's defense is shaky, but their pass rush has been good so far. That was true last year. Obviously, Vic Fangio was there, so it's a little bit of a different story now. But they're still at the top of the league through 2 weeks, and Cleveland as well, one of the better pass rushes. Buffalo's kind of towards the middle of the pack there. And not only that, but I think that where their strength is the secondary. And I post this graph of separation prevented. And Buffalo had no team has 2 corners in the top range there, but Buffalo has 4. And granted, Teron Johnson's hurt. It's a small sample, but we've seen this for a bunch of years now of Sean McDermott turning these 6th round picks out of Villanova into studs.
Tell me about it. As someone who was on Miami and their passing offense last week, the pre-Tua injury, that was tough to watch.
That was. I mean, Tua, I don't know what was happening on some of those turnovers, but a lot of them, they were just confusing him. Offensive players not running the right routes, and this is a good defense. This is a good secondary. But where they're particularly vulnerable, I think, is they've allowed the least separation of any team, and Jacksonville has generated the second most separation. And I think these 2 angles are not isolated from each other, because if Jacksonville has more time to throw, it's going to mean more separation. And like they're attacking the ball extremely deep this year. Trevor Lawrence's depth of target is like 13, which would be number 1 in the NFL in every other season except Anthony Richardson's at like 17 because he's only thrown the ball like 35 times and they've been mostly deep bombs. I say that semi-facetiously, but I think like we don't really know that much about the Jacksonville offense if they have a little bit more time to throw, and I anticipate that they do. They've also, like, we have to mention in any conversation about Jacksonville, they had 5 drops last week. They had some more week 1. Like, these things cannot sustain itself over time. I think you want to look at the underlying numbers. Trevor Lawrence is second in deep grade. He's second in deep accuracy. Now, part of that has to do with his wide receivers, but that's not changing anytime soon. We still have the same wide receivers. And I think with a little bit more time, we can kind of start to see the Jacksonville offense unlocked a bit. That's kind of my take on that. I'll stop there. That's my take on the Jacksonville side of things. It's hard because like we're going on year 2 of the same story and to some extent year 3. And the analytics person in me is wanting to say like, okay, these are generally unstable areas. They're going to regress. But you also have to kind of be sensitive to particular situations. And like maybe there's something that is not captured here in the data that would suggest that like this is repeating itself for a reason. And I'm kind of torn by that. I'm still going to stand strong in my Jacksonville conviction because I think there's such a gap between the underlying numbers and the production. But it's a tricky question and one that I think bettors have to take seriously.
So what I'm hearing is Gabe Davis revenge game. That's what I'm hearing.
That's it. So you can cut through all of the, I just keep blabbering on and it's Gabe Davis. That's all that needed to be said.
I kind of view this a little bit differently on that side of the ball. Not that what you're saying in terms of there's going to be regression, there probably will. This is a tough matchup for it, in my opinion, because Buffalo under Sean McDermott has consistently, like year after year, been one of the best teams at eliminating deep targets. Like teams don't even try it against them. This year, they are the only team in the NFL through 2 weeks that hasn't allowed a completion 20-plus yards downfield. And to your point, that is where Jacksonville has been trying to live. Lawrence has more deep attempts than Anthony Richardson. Right? He's under him in ADOT, but he's thrown the ball 20-plus yards downfield 11 times. The Bills, I have faith in their ability to take away those downfield shots just because we've seen it for years. And then from a pass rush perspective, that's a weakness for Jacksonville, right? The offensive line is shaky, especially if you're trying to hold the ball and get it downfield. And from Buffalo, the Miami limits pressure well, so the overall pressure numbers aren't great, but they're second for us in team pass rush grade. The Jacksonville offensive line is 26th in pass blocking grade. And quietly massive development for Buffalo is that Von Miller looks like Von Miller again. He has that speed and bend around the outside. He's got the spin move off of it. That was not the case at all last year. He was a shell of himself. But through the first 2 weeks, there's been flashes of him being still a top tier guy, at least situationally, when they want to use him to get home. And he's going up against Anton Harrison on that right tackle side, who's been a real weak point for Jacksonville. So if I think Buffalo can take away those deep shots that Jacksonville wants to hit, and I think they can get home with pressure, it's a tough spot for me to believe in the Jacksonville offense.
Yeah, no, it's fair. I think it really is a strength on strength matchup. And like that's the frame I think of how to view it. I just see like a possibility that Jacksonville's going to have some success, but there are some serious drawbacks. I would agree there, and it's not the easiest spot. I think what's also interesting on this game is like looking at the Bills' offense, and like under Joe Brady, they've been a real run-heavy team. In some way, they were like the first to kind of like eliminate, so to speak, this like passing game and just like go like 8% run over expected, rely on like Josh Allen's legs too in kind of key spots. And I think that just lends itself to a lot of these high variance games. I think the thought is that in general, when you run the ball, there's like less variance just because like your risk of turnover is lower. But I actually think when you have a quarterback the caliber of Josh Allen, the more you run the ball, the more variance you introduce because it's a fewer it's less of a sample for like your best player, i.e. the biggest advantage you have, to do his thing. And that just kind of makes me uncomfortable. And like and make it uncomfortable is like irrelevant for betting. Like my feelings don't really matter here. But the point is Buffalo looks like they had this dominant win against the Dolphins. And it was, but like that was also a function of turnovers. And like the Buffalo offense didn't have to do much. And their game against Arizona was like kind of dicey late. I think they're going to be in a lot of these spots where you're kind of frustrated that they haven't pulled away late. And there's like some margin to this game. The Bills were, they were 5.5-point favorites. It's been bet down a bit, where if Jacksonville has this success passing and they do regress and they can kind of mitigate what Buffalo does best, I think there's just a spot of Buffalo shooting themselves in the foot and continuing to run the ball and not really relying on Josh Allen. That also has me kind of concerned on the Bills side.
I see this side a little differently too. And I think it mainly comes down to the matchup angle, where we talked about it last week. Jacksonville is playing man coverage all the time. Like it's 57% through the first 2 weeks of the season. First in the NFL. There's only 2 teams above 50. It's them and the Broncos. And that's something that the Bills offense has had success against man coverage for the last couple years. Right? If you look at Josh Allen's passing grades against man since 2022, the 3 highest graded quarterbacks in the league: Burrow, Allen, Mahomes. And yes, you don't have Stephon Diggs, right? And a lot of this is a function of receivers. And I refuse to bet on a Bills receiver. I don't know. I don't know where those targets are going. I can't make any sense of it. The one piece I do like here is James Cook receiving specifically. And that's something that we've seen with Joe Brady offenses going back to when he was at LSU. It's a big reason Clyde Edwards-Helaire was drafted in the first round. It's kind of how he was used as a receiver. Didn't really get a big sample with CMC in Carolina when he was there, but we've seen it again in Buffalo. And when they feel like they've got man coverage looks, they will scheme stuff up for him. The 4th and 3 touchdown against Miami being an example. And I think he's someone who can win in those situations. I think it's an area, even though I don't know where it's going to come from, I have faith in Allen's ability both to pick the right matchups, to deliver the ball, to scramble when guys have his back to him, have their back to him. And I think it's a good matchup for the Bills offense, where they're not necessarily just going to rely on the run game.
Yeah, no, I wish that were true, and I think that
maybe I'm coaching my bets here. Maybe I'm speaking.
That's kind of my problem. Of I would be all over the Bills if I had a feeling if I knew they were going to pass. But I think the point you bring up about man is particularly interesting. And I want to be attacking the Jacksonville defense when they're playing the Dolphins, when they're playing a team that the offense has a clear matchup advantage, and I just don't see that at all with the Bills. Who's going to really take advantage of the fact that the Jaguars are playing a ton of man coverage with back corners? I don't think Curtis Samuel or Keon Coleman, Marquez Valdez-Scantling are these deep threats or these man beaters that are going to really punish Jacksonville. But the point I think also is all relative to the base of the Bills are still favorites for good reason, and they are still a great offense. And there's a reason for that. It's relative to that expectation, where can we kind of deviate, at least on the path, at least in my approach. And I think that's on the Jacksonville side. And I don't see, especially now considering the market was really selling on Buffalo last week. They were 3-point underdogs, 2.5-point underdogs against the Dolphins. That to me was okay, what's happening here? We're really kind of overselling the new Buffalo offense. But now we've kind of flipped back. And to me, when I look in that frame, that's what Jacksonville becomes particularly intriguing. Though all of the angles you mentioned are certainly viable and certainly would lead to some value on the Bills.
Yeah, I think just talking through it, I have to be on Buffalo. If I like their defense, I like their offense to that extent. Probably under on Lawrence, I can see, and over on Cook receiving. But I see your angle too, right? You're taking the chance on the talent, and it's easy to bet on talent with Trevor Lawrence and Brian Thomas, who has looked great, and they're another team that has some weapons. for Lawrence to get the ball to.
Yeah. So I was going to be on an SGP, in all honesty. I anticipated Trevor Lawrence's prop was 225 last week, and I anticipated his number being something similar, and there would be some value on the passing attack. Since we started recording, his passing prop has been released, and it is sitting around like the 260 range. And that, I mean, the plus, yeah, it's even higher than that. It's like 275. At that price, that's not something I'm willing to back. I guess the market, if anything, I kind of like the under now for a lot.
I like the under more now that you say that.
Yeah, I would be on the Trevor Lawrence under here, especially on this in the strength on strength. So no SGP for me, but I do still think the Jaguars are an appealing underdog here.
Well, talking about SGPs, let's get into it. So there's no Jaguars SGP, but what other situations are you looking at in the games that we haven't hit on yet? Around the week?
So I'm gonna go first with Anthony Richardson, his all passing yards, and then that going to Alec Pierce. Right, they're playing the Bears. They're only a point favorite. That's kind of a interesting number. I'd be curious your thoughts very briefly on that game, but. What I think hasn't been covered is that Alec Pierce is the guy in Indianapolis. I think Michael Pittman was kind of assumed as this is more of this possession receiver, a guy who's going to try and beat you in that intermediate range. But Anthony Richardson loves throwing deep, and that's kind of this offense of like a real run and gun style. And Alec Pierce has a 30% target rate. He's doing most of his work against zone coverage. I also think Josh Downs is going to be back this week, which is going to cut into AD Mitchell shares, but Alec Pierce is going to be on the field. He's leading them in snaps. He's generating a ton of targets. He's also winning downfield. And I think when you think about how the Colts put together a big passing day, it's just like they're going to be taking their shots. They're going to be taking one or two of these. They didn't really have that opportunity in that like ridiculously fluky, wacky game script where Green Bay ran the ball like 60 times. That's not sustaining itself. They're going to run more plays. As a result, Anthony Richardson's yardage numbers are way down, but with him at quarterback, especially if the play volume is up, and I anticipate that being the case, this is a Chicago team that's going to be a pass funnel. And I do think Indianapolis still has some success on the ground, but you're getting like plus 800 for 250 yards. It's a couple of deep bombs to Alec Pierce, and I think that's a game in which they win because if they are hitting on some explosives and still kind of with the base that the Colts have rushing the football, on the flip side, I'm selling Caleb Williams' ability to kind of put up points on the Chicago side. I really like that. Richardson to Pierce and in a Colts win.
Yeah, it's Pierce should owe some commission to Richardson or something on his next contract because going from Gardner Minshew last year to Richardson, it just suits him, right? That's what he does. He wins vertically. And Richardson's going to hit him 60 yards downfield off his back foot like we saw in the week 1 game against Houston. And it's a much better situation for him, and I like that angle. I do think I don't have a lot of faith in the Bears offense. I'll start out by prefacing it with that. But the Colts are one of these teams they're not going to throw stuff at Caleb Williams. Like they're going to rush 4. They're going to play 66% cover 3 is what it's at, which is crazy through 2 weeks. They're the only team above 50. So it's going to be one of these situations. Unlike Houston kind of deviated from what they did. They blitzed pretty heavily. They changed some things up on the back end. The Colts, you know what you're going to get going into it. So it's a much more static matchup. Not to say that I don't think the Colts are going to win this game, but I do think it's a bounce back spot for this Bears offense too.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair. It does, I guess, give me some kind of PTSD of the Colts just do what they do. And they were like, hey, we're not going to sell out to stop the run with Malik Willis at quarterback. But
I couldn't believe that. That was one of my I had more conviction in that just based on what I'd seen from Malik Willis in Tennessee. Yeah. And Matt LaFleur might be a wizard. I don't know.
That's the number one reason to not coach your bets, because in the second half, when they're like, hey, let's sell out to stop the run, Green Bay didn't do anything. But for whatever reason, Indianapolis was just like, nah, we're not going to do that to start the game, even though that was so obviously going to be the game plan. I salvaged it with a massive Malik Willis under. after one drive. And I'm like, oh, Green Bay is really not passing the ball. Like they're going to do the Army thing here and just like run triple option. Is it Army or Navy? Whatever.
Both. Yeah,
both do it.
It's a service academy thing. Navy might have moved out of it, but
there you go.
Yeah, Army still does for sure.
Either way, on to the next. Sticking with a similar kind of angle of like receivers who are like taking up a huge share that I don't think the markets have quite adjusted to yet, and that is Jackson Smith-Njigba, who last season was kind of the like. I mean, DK Metcalf was the number one, and then Tyler Lockett was still pretty clearly the number two. Now that's kind of flipped, and JSN leads the team. He's gotten a target on 31% of his routes. The Seahawks, when everyone else has been running the ball a lot, if you look at the pass rates over expected across the league, they are very, very down. A team that is still throwing the ball a lot are the Seattle Seahawks, and that's been the case for a couple of years now. I think that Miami's also going to be a serious pass funnel, and we spoke about the pass rush as the strength, but the secondary has been really, really weak. They've been allowing a lot of explosive plays and a very high depth of target against both of those are top five. And I think when you look on the flip side of the ball, Seattle has done a great job with these simulated pressure looks. I mean, Mike McDonald's been doing this for years. They're generating a ton of these pressure disruptions. That's disruption that causes a quarterback to go off his read. And we've got Skylar Thompson on the other side of the ball. The difference, as a little side note, between like the time to throw for Skylar Thompson and Tua Tagovailoa, which is like, this is supposedly the same offense, and Tua Tagovailoa is like making the right reads in 2.3 seconds, and Skylar Thompson's at like 2.9. Very interesting, but leave that as an aside. I see this as a spot where Seattle's going to get a bunch of sacks, a lot of pressure. Miami's not going to be able to sustain drives, and I think that just means more plays for Seattle where they're going to be passing. Jackson Smith-Njigba is like the number one receiver on this team right now. They're using him a lot more vertically, where like last year they were not doing that at all. I see this as a spot where he's just like fundamentally mispriced. And I think you can kind of see a decent passing day from Geno and Jackson Smith-Njigba.
Yeah, the changes that they made offensively, moving from Shane Waldron to Ryan Grubb, I think it's just unlocked more of the field for them. And Smith-Njigba has been one of the beneficiaries. And the pass rush, to your point, has looked good for them too. Granted, grain of salt going against the Patriots and the Broncos in the first 2 weeks. But if we're going to get Skylar Thompson holding onto the ball for 3 seconds per play behind that Miami offensive line, that's not that dissimilar, right? It's a very different story when you take away all the pressure deterring things that have had a lot of success with Tua there. So
that's right. And I think we got to pencil in the Seahawks Lions next week. I think that's a Monday nighter. I mean, I guess we're talking about the Lions again, but I definitely want to hear more of your thoughts on the Seattle schematic angles. My last one here, and I think there are just a lot of very compelling game scripts that can lead to this, is Lamar Jackson alt rushing in a Dallas win. I think this line is priced right. I think this is like a pretty intriguing game. But Dallas has allowed a lot of these quarterback scrambles early in the season. Lamar Jackson's also his design rushes are up. And I think we're going to see a bunch of those. And you're getting this inverse correlation with Dallas winning, where I think we see as Baltimore kind of goes with this, their ordinary game plan, their neutral script game plan, so to speak, you're going to see a lot more of these rushes. I just like that angle in general. And then when you add on a game script in which Baltimore's playing from behind, those are just plenty more dropbacks for Lamar Jackson to scramble. I see this as a spot where, I mean, Dallas, as you kind of predicted, they played a bunch of man coverage in week one, and as the season's gone along, they were much more zone heavy last season. But if Lamar Jackson's under duress, as he's been because of his offensive line, and like he's going up against Michael Parsons, I think that just unlocks a lot more of these opportunities for scrambles. So I see kind of two paths to this bet hitting of just like one, this can stay in a neutral situation until late, and Lamar Jackson's just relying on like their offense has a lot of these design rushes now. And the second of like, especially if Dallas is up ahead and Baltimore's playing from a lead, a lot of these scrambles, and he's in a real spot to scramble. And you get this inverse correlation, I guess a little sneak here of books do not seem to be adjusting to the fact that quarterback rushing yards are not created the same as running back rushing yards. And that's a spot I'm going to be looking to attack.
I really like that one. I think it's a good bounce back spot for Dallas because I know I said their pass rush could wreck the game last week. I think this is a spot where the Ravens aren't doing the same things that you saw with Clint Kubiak in New Orleans, and the offensive line has a lot of turnover. There's a lot of question marks there. And like you said, you get both the scramble aspect and the design rushing aspect. So I really like that one. Probably my favorite of the three you highlighted there.
There we go.
Let's round it out and close things out with a couple key insights and just an overview of what this is. This is a product that PFF is rolling out that I'm working on, which is basically just kind of taking data and using a model to spit out strength on weakness matchups and things that could be useful in a player prop bet. I'm writing up 4 of my favorites each week over at pff.com with a PFF Plus subscription. And highlighting a 2 that I like here. One is Brock Bowers kind of stepping immediately into a high volume role in the Las Vegas offense. He's been targeted on 26% of his routes. That's 6th highest among tight ends. The Panthers have allowed targets to tight ends at the 3rd highest rate in the NFL, and Bowers has been as advertised, right? He's finding these holes underneath. He's making tough catches over the middle of the field. He can add on after the catch. And I'm interested to see what you think about this game. We kind of hit it on it a little bit with Andy Dalton stepping in for Bryce Young. And I think the Panthers immediately become a little bit more competitive, which kind of reduces the risk of a game where the Raiders just are going to lean into running the ball a ton. So I like Bowers overs in this spot against Carolina.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I think that, to your point, there is like some bounce back effect. And like, I don't think the situation around Bryce Young is like that terrible. He's had plenty of clean pockets to work with. I think it's only going to improve with Dalton. And like, we spoke about it a lot. It's like last season, Dalton had that one game where he was much, much better. I think he's also like, there's this idea of like, once someone's like a backup quarterback, that they are just like almost equally bad. I'm obviously like saying that flippantly, but like Andy Dalton is like a fine starter. He's better than Gardner Minshew, I think. And like, he's probably in that like bottom tier of like 22nd to 26th best quarterback. He's not a disaster. And I do like this as like their defense is atrocious. And I think that, to your point, like Brock Bowers is legit, and they have a lot of these really great weapons. And Devontae Adams is obviously still a number 1 receiver. I think this game plays out fairly close, and both teams kind of have to stick to a neutral script, and you're not just going to see teams run the ball a million times on Carolina because it's 48-0 after the first quarter.
I can't believe you're out here taking shots at Gardner after he's
look, like Gardner Minshew. You just got to understand what he is, right? I mean, he's not turning into this great quarterback, but I do think is like really going to be elevated by this situation. And by situation, usually I mean scheme, but like they've got some real weapons. Like Jacoby Myers hasn't done anything yet. He's a really good player. I love Trey Tucker. Like they have a bunch of guys who can elevate Minshew, but 5.5 points is too much.
Yeah, I agree. The other one that I wanted to highlight to wrap things up, I'm going to keep going back to the well with running backs against the Eagles. You can't stop me. I'm going to do it until the wheels fall off. I was on Jacobs in week 1. I was on Bijan last week. And now you've got the Saints, who have been an absolute house running the ball. And Kamara has been explosive, right? He's not he doesn't have the same burst necessarily that he did early in his career, but he's still got really good contact balance, and he's looked really good in this offense through the first few weeks. Tied first in the NFL with 7 runs of 10+ yards. He's had big holes. That offensive line, I still have, like, if you can get them into straight drop back situations, I still have concerns about them in pass protection. But I think it's a good run blocking unit, and they're doing interesting things in the run game. And the Eagles have been bad. Like they've invested a lot of resources onto that defensive line, Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis and some of these other guys. They've just been getting bullied. And I don't really see that changing. They're 31st in EPA allowed per run play. Obviously, Kamara's line is going to probably be juiced up, but it's an awesome spot for a rushing offense that has been elite through the first few weeks of the season.
Yeah, I think that's great. And the one thing I'd also highlight is like relative to previous seasons is like Kamara is not in a timeshare. Like he is the clear number one running back. I mean, he got basically all of the work while this game was still relevant in week one and in week two, excuse me, and a similar story in week one of like they're feeding him the ball. And I think it might still be a while for Marcus to adjust to that. I mean, his lines are going to be high, but it's a great spot.
That's all we got. Any closing thoughts before we can kick it off?
I can't wait